I work for a well-known university as a field biologist and have recently been contracted out to the National Forest Service. My first assignment has been in the Potomac district of the Monongahela National Forest. Basically, I receive GPS coordinates and I either drive or hike to the destination spot and do what they want me to do. This could be setting up trail cameras and or counters, monitoring equipment, trail surveys and the like, and then recording the data 24 hours after placement. No big deal. I thought it odd that they specifically requested I place the cameras only 3 feet off the ground, and some of the infrared cameras in the trees at specific heights. Some of these locations are on designated trails, but some are way off the trail in places humans would never go. Sometimes there isn't a hotel or lodging close enough, as these are remote mountains, and the Forest Service has outfitted me in some pretty dank camping gear on the occasions I have to camp. I am an experienced hiker and camper, and have spent many nights alone out in the field due to my career choice. And I'm a woman, about 5'6" and 130 pounds, and not really afraid of anything. Again, the Forest Service has outfitted me well, and I wear an emergency beacon that will send every law enforcement officer in the area to my location in no time. So I've been assigned to this district for a few months now, and have really enjoyed my work. Now, West Virginia is very remote and unspoiled, and that's why I do what I do. I get to see things most people wouldn't, and I've had so many positive and almost spiritual moments, until a few nights ago. I was working up near Spruce Knob, which is the highest point in West Virginia, and a complex system of trails, wilderness areas, and camping. It has also been snowing, with howling winds and ice storms. I was camping up there to complete my work, and while the conditions were rough, I was almost enjoying it. My first night in the woods were pretty peaceful. I made dinner, set up camp, and drank some whiskey and smoked some really good bud. I snuggled down in my sleeping bag and slept like a rock. It was very cold, but I wear this turtle fur mask thing, and didn't feel the cold too much. I woke up at dawn and went about building my fire back up and starting some coffee when I noticed all this churned up snow around my campsite. Not tracks, just churned up snow, like someone or something had kicked it around. Weird, but whatever. I had a 15-mile hike to set some cameras and didn't really have time to wonder about it. I set off on my hike, did what I had to do, and started back to camp. I never wear earbuds or anything because hearing is one of the most important senses in the wilderness. I want to be able to hear any animal or person before I see them. It was already getting past dark when I made it back to camp, and I was too tired to do anything except strip down to my base layer and getting my sleeping bag and pass out. Well, it was around 2 a.m. when I woke up, because I could hear people talking. People. I was about 30 miles up a gravel road that was locked with Forest Service gates and about 10 miles from where my truck was parked. And I could hear voices. I have my firearm. I quietly retrieved it from my pack and got back in my sleeping bag and cocked it and waited. I was on high alert, all my senses going wild. Eventually the voices faded and I couldn't hear them anymore, but I never went back to sleep. At daylight, I emerged from my tent to more churned up snow, and my 2 trail cameras hanging from a tree about 5 foot from my tent. Cameras I had placed 15 miles out from my campsite. I packed my stuff as fast as I could and hauled ass back to my truck. Along the way I saw a lot of human boot tracks all around my site, and when I reached my truck, I discovered it had been broken into and my computer and other equipment had been stolen. I am currently in a luxury log cabin at some resort, too scared to retrieve my other equipment and too embarrassed to tell my superiors how afraid I am. The Forest Service brought me a new truck while the other one was getting the window replaced, and I did make a report about the theft, but there's no way in hell I'm going back to that site. I don't know if this means I'll be fired or sent to work at a desk, but out of all the years I've been doing this in the national forest around the country, this is the most terrified I've ever been. So I finally went back to retrieve my equipment and the 2 cams that were hanging near my site. I took a friend that is a former Marine with me, and the equipment I placed was undisturbed, but the 2 cams that were hanging near my campsite were both missing their memory cards. I didn't tell my supervisor how scared I was, but I did say that someone had messed with the cameras and stolen the memory cards. I also formally requested never to be sent back there again. I still work with Spruce Knob, but never anywhere that remote. I truly hope it was just teenagers looking to steal and maybe have some fun at my expense. Every person around here has been exceptionally nice, even if most hate the National Forest Service. My granddad used to tell me this story. In the small town of Horsepen, there was an old man called Bob Bowman. He lived way back in a dark hollow, and only came to town to sell his hides and buy the odd necessities he needed for his solitary life. On these odd trips to town, old Bob would never speak much, though he would grunt and mumble, and he would do this incoherently when walking down the street, or he would direct those sounds to anyone that tried to speak to him. Most people avoided Bob Bowman. Some said he was as wild as the animals in the woods, and it would only take the slightest thing to provoke him. The only person he had a decent relationship with was the owner of the general store, who appreciated the steady flow of good hides onto his shelves. Even though most in Horsepen would cross the road if they saw him coming, he was a frequent topic in all manner of rumors and speculation. Now Horsepen was a quiet coal mining town, where the main pastime would be discussing the happenings of other kin and residents. The men would do this around the stove of the general store, and the women in church. About every month, when Bob Bowman would come around, his presence would be well discussed by both groups, but only the store owner noticed his disappearance. He brought up Bowman's absence one evening when the regulars drew near his stove. The men looked completely unconcerned at first, but then they realized a visit to Bowman's shack would be a ready chance to test some of the speculation. So the next day a posse formed, led by the owner, to look for old Bob. The entrance to his hollow was on the outskirts of town, a good way away from the store, church, and mine entrance. Still, it was a well-known place, somewhere that old women and skittish men would quicken to pass all the sooner, and somewhere where teenage boys would gather to spook the other, usually at the height of the Bowman gossip. The look of the hollow befitted its infamy. It was rocky, steep and dark. The water flowing through it had turned black because of the mine's underground sprawl. The group took the hike over the rough land, and they followed the dark stream up the mountain. About 3/4 of the way to the ridge, they found Bowman's shack in an even dip in the hillside. The listing walls were made of tar paper and logs. It was small, one room, and a small outbuilding that was somehow rougher than the main shack. The main building was lifeless. There were no lights or any sounds, and the shopkeeper pushed aside the pelt door, and inside were all the usual keepings of a solitary man. Inside the rock and mud fireplace were some odd live coals. The shopkeeper was content. Most everyone else was disappointed. There had been no great mystery to uncover. Some more skittish men were content to see the place and live to tell about it. The two that fell into that opinion were eager to leave before Bowman returned. The store owner wanted to wait a few minutes to see if Bowman was all right, while the youngest wanted to look further. The store owner would not let the youngest look in the house. No one thought it was a particularly good idea, so he looked around the place, scanning the animal bones and other trash around the shack. The other building was overlooked by everyone, including the youngest, as it was too small to be anything other than an outhouse. Still, eventually he checked inside. It was not a usual outhouse, rather some sort of shrine made of bones arranged like prizes, all pointing to shelves on the wall adjacent to the door. Featured 3 human skulls, skillfully cleaned and carefully arranged in between 2 burnt short candles. The youngest just stared on in shock until one of the others noticed. When he saw, he called the others until they all stared on in collective horror. The stupor of the group was only broken when they heard the far-off mumbling and grunting of Bob Bowman. The group had a moment to decide whether to confront Bob or run, and, in his own territory, at his own house, they all silently agreed to run. Some heard Bowman chasing them away, some only heard each other, but still they made it out of the woods bearing their odd tale. No one ever saw Bob Bowman again. No one was brave enough to go back to his home, and most assumed he was not brave enough to return to town after everyone knew of his dark secret. My granddad used to tell me this story, as well as others, from his childhood in Horsepen when I was young. It is probably somewhat true, and though I am older and this story has grown distant to him, he still remembers seeing Bowman in town and hearing stories about him. I recall very well how he described the old general store, the coals in the shack of Bowman, and the skulls. I have seen Bowman's Holler but never went in. I should say the shrine may have been in a cellar instead of an outbuilding. I couldn't imagine Bowman's shack having one. That's the fuzziest part for me. I work full-time in healthcare, which is a high-stress job, and it can be quite overwhelming and physically and mentally draining. So on my days off, to de-stress and relax, I love to go on drives by the ocean by myself or with my best friend. Most of the time we would go late at night to watch the stars or the moon, or simply just to listen to the ocean. It was a cold and dark November night. Usually I get off work at around 11, but tonight I was leaving work at 1 a.m. The perks of working in healthcare. I worked in a tiny little town about an hour west of the big city. I lived about 45 minutes away and was dreading the drive home. It was very windy out that night, and as I left work, the brown leaves swirled around me into the parking lot. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I slid into the front seat of my car. When my co-worker had come to relieve me, she had advised me to take the old highway home, not my usual route of the new highway. "It's so windy my car almost blew off the highway," she had said. The old highway ran almost parallel to the new one, except it snaked through thick forest and wound along the coastline. Normally it would take me 45 minutes to get home, but taking the old highway would take me at least an hour. But I wasn't worried about time. I was just worried about making it home safely. As I drove, my headlights illuminated the thick trees lining the road. The wind would make my car sway every now and then, making me grip the wheel all the tighter. And all I could think about was the warmth of my bed. And I sighed, turning on my Bluetooth to listen to one of my podcasts. There was no one else on the road, and I hadn't seen a car in over 20 minutes. There were no street lamps on the old highway, and it was very dark, with thick forest on either side, little beaches, and a house every now and then. About 10 minutes later, I passed through a tiny town, if you could even call it a town. It had a grocery store, a drugstore, a few restaurants, and an old gas station. It was a tiny little trailer with a few pumps that sold cheap cigarettes closing at 8 p.m., and as I drove by the gas station, I noticed the first vehicle I had seen in a while. An old truck was idling in the gravel parking lot by the gas station. This wasn't unusual, as it was a fishing town and it was starting to become lobster season. But as I drove by, I could see the outline of someone sitting in the truck. It gave me a weird sense of comfort to know I wasn't the only one awake and on the road at this time. I kept on driving, but I could feel myself growing very tired. About 10 minutes ahead, there was a little beach that I loved, so I decided to pull over and stop for a few minutes to have a quick smoke. The cold air and the sound of the waves would probably do a better job of waking me up than my podcast could. And it was stormy out, so the waves would be huge, and I loved watching the ocean's magnificent waves pummel the coastline during a storm. I pulled into the gravel parking lot by the beach and parked at the very end. There was no one else there, and as I parked, I put down my window and lit my smoke. I stepped out the car for a few moments to try and get a glimpse of the waves, but the wind was so strong it almost took my breath away. The cold air was harsh as it hit my face, but it did its job by waking me up. But that was enough for me. I shivered and got back into the car, turning the heat on high. I breathed in the cold, salty air and finally felt myself relax. It had been a rough shift, and I was grateful to have a few days off after tonight. About halfway through my smoke, headlights swept across my car as another vehicle pulled into the parking lot. It parked about 100 yards away from me and idled for a few minutes before turning off. I was plunged into darkness again, with no sound except for the crashing waves and wind. All of a sudden, I started to get an uneasy feeling in my stomach, and was unsure why. It was not uncommon for another vehicle to be here at this hour, and lots of people would come to the beach late at night, myself included. Some would walk along the beach in the moonlight, or smoke a joint around a little fire, or young couples would come to mess around in their cars, but still I felt uneasy. I glanced at the time and it was 1:40 a.m. Shivering to myself, I lit up another smoke and leaned back in my seat, trying to ignore the growing heaviness in my stomach. But I was enjoying the sound of the waves and was reluctant to leave just yet. I'll leave after I finish my smoke, I told myself. Usually the beach was lit up by the moonlight, but tonight it was so dark, the only sounds were of the waves hitting the beach and the wind whistling through my car. After a few moments, I thought I heard the sound of gravel crunching, but looked around and didn't see anything. I shrugged and rubbed my eyes, suddenly feeling tired again. I was almost done with my smoke, so I put my foot on the brake to start my car. The red light of my brakes illuminated something through my rearview mirror for just a split second, or at least I thought I had seen something, but when I looked back again there was nothing there. I shook my head and tossed my smoke out of the car, laughing to myself. It's all these true crime podcasts I've been listening to, they're getting to me, I thought to myself as I put the car in reverse and glanced at my side mirror before reversing, and my heart almost dropped out of my stomach. There, illuminated by the red light, was a figure crouched down, leaning against the side of my car near the brake light. He seemed to be slowly inching closer to the driver door. A jolt of fear ran through me, and I froze for a moment. Then fight or flight kicked in, and my body chose flight. I slammed my foot on the gas, and my car reversed quickly. The figure jumped out of the way as I switched the gear to drive, my headlights illuminating a man in a dark sweater and jeans, running towards the other vehicle. It was the truck that I had seen earlier by the gas station. My heart sank as I felt sick to my stomach as I floored it out the parking lot and back on the road. I was terrified. I was about 20 minutes from home. The old highway was basically one long winding road with very few side streets and not many options to hide, in case he followed me. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, praying I wouldn't see headlights behind me. But after a few moments, they were there. My stomach dropped again, and I increased my speed. There had to be a road up ahead I could quickly turn into and hide. Luck must have been on my side, because as I turned a sharp bend, the headlights disappeared from my rear view momentarily, and I could see there was a little gravel road quickly coming up on the left. I yanked the steering wheel left, barely braking, and turned, gunning it up the little road. The road was so narrow it would only fit one car, and I was relieved to see the road had many turns, which would hide me from the main road. After getting a few 100 yards down the road, I quickly shut off my lights and rolled into a park, and I sat there shaking in total darkness, praying I wouldn't see the headlights come up the road behind me. It was silent, except for my harsh breathing. My heart was pounding. I rolled down my window and listened. It was quiet, and all I could hear was the wind blowing through the trees. I couldn't stop shaking. I wasn't a religious person, but I sat there praying I wouldn't see those headlights, praying to just make it home safely to my warm bed, praying that all of this is just a nightmare. With nothing but the dark forest surrounding me, I waited. 10 minutes went by, then 20. Nothing. The tension in my body eased, and the sinking feeling in my stomach started to fade. I gave myself another 10 minutes, took some deep breaths, and then turned on my car, keeping my lights low. I had to do almost a 10-point turn to get myself turned back around on the narrow road, but I somehow managed to, and slowly drove down the little road back to the main road. As I came to the main road, I hesitated. I could see a few kilometers in each direction, as the road snaked around the coastline, and didn't see any vehicles on the road. I took a deep breath and turned left towards home. The whole drive back, I was tense, but I did not see that old truck again. Only 2 cars passed me, one being a police officer and the other being a Jeep, but I made it home fine. As I pulled into my driveway and turned off my car, I made the promise to myself to never go to that beach at night again. My buddy and I were on a weekend backpacking trip near the Finger Lakes in upstate New York, and at the time, I was still pretty new to that kind of thing. It was only my second real backpacking trip, so everything still felt a little unfamiliar. My friend had done a lot more of these trips than I had, so I was mostly following his lead and trying to keep up. A few miles into the trail, we came across this scenic overlook that made the whole hike worth it. It was a spot where the trees just opened up enough to give you a wide view of the valleys, with the lake stretching out in the distance and everything glowing in that late afternoon light. We dropped our packs for a bit and just took it in. And that's when we noticed the guy. He was already up there with his dog standing near the edge. Probably been there a while. At first, nothing about him seemed off. It's a public trail after all. People pass through, chit-chat and move on. He struck up a conversation with us and asked the usual stuff about where we were coming from and how far we were going. And then the tone changed. It wasn't immediate, more subtle at first. His questions started getting more specific and not in a casual way. He asked how long we were planning to stay out there, where exactly we were thinking of setting up camp, whether we had anyone else meeting us later, or if it was just the 2 of us. There was something about the way he asked. He wasn't just making conversation. What he was doing was gathering information. I remember catching my buddy's eye at one point, and we both kind of had the same look, like, yeah, this is getting weird, and we kept our answers intentionally vague and didn't give him anything too specific. And after a few more minutes, we made an excuse and headed back onto the trail. Neither of us said much at first, but once we were out of earshot, we both admitted that the guy gave off really bad vibes. We kept hiking for a few more miles before picking a spot to set up camp. It was tucked down near a river with a small waterfall not too far off, so there was a constant sound of rushing water in the background. It actually felt pretty peaceful once we got settled in, and for a while it helped take our minds off the earlier encounter. But still, that uneasy feeling didn't go away. By the time it got dark, we had a small fire going, ate, and eventually crawled into the tent. It had to have been around 11 p.m. at that point. We were both exhausted, but for some reason neither of us could fall asleep. I kept thinking about the guy, how he had been watching us a little too closely, and how interested he was in where we'd be that night. The woods have a way of amplifying those thoughts. Everything feels closer because you're more exposed. We'd probably been lying there in silence for about 20 minutes when I started to hear something. Now at first, I thought it was just part of the river, or maybe the wind catching something just right, but the longer I listened, the more the sound stood out. It wasn't random noise. There was a rhythm to it, almost like music, and it sounded like it was coming from up on the far ridge, maybe 30 yards away from where we had set up. It wasn't loud, like a speaker blasting music, more like something carried through the air in pieces, rising and falling. I lay there listening, trying to figure out what I was actually hearing. It went on long enough that I started questioning myself, wondering if I was just imagining it. Then out of nowhere, my buddy shifted next to me and said, "Hey, do you hear that?" And that's the moment my stomach dropped, because it meant it wasn't just in my head. You mean the music?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied. We both just laid there for a second after that, listening. It kept going steady and rhythmic, completely out of place in the middle of nowhere. There were no campsites nearby that we knew of, no visible lights, nothing that would explain someone playing music up on a ridge that late at night, and finally we decided to check. We unzipped the tent and stepped outside, scanning the tree line, trying to get our eyes adjusted to the dark, and the second we were fully out in the open, the sound cut off completely. We stood there for a while listening hard, expecting it to start up again or to hear footsteps or anything that might give us a clue. But there was nothing. Just the river and the waterfall, the same natural sounds that had been there the whole time. And whatever we had been hearing before had been louder than both. We didn't see any lights or hear anyone moving, or find any sign that someone had been up there at all. So eventually we just retreated back to our tents, but neither of us were exactly relaxed after that. We stayed awake for another hour or so, listening and waiting for something else to happen, but it never did. And at some point, exhaustion won out, and we both fell asleep. Nothing else happened that night, and we never ran into that guy again. But the whole thing left us with this lingering feeling that something wasn't right, that maybe we hadn't been as alone out there as we had thought. I still don't know what that sound was. Perhaps it was someone messing around in the woods. Maybe it was just something carrying weirdly through the terrain. Or maybe it was just an event that no one can really explain. But the timing of it, especially after the encounter earlier in the day, made it feel more than just mere coincidence. This encounter happened years ago. So I grew up in a tiny French village in mid-northern France, in an area that is mostly well known for its massive forest. My little village was in the middle of this forest, surrounded by trees on all sides. Most of its secluded population was of an elderly demographic. The forest was large enough that if you walked into it in one direction, it would be hours, maybe even days if you chose a bad trajectory, until you'd find any other proper civilization, aside from the occasional lone road. Now don't get me wrong, The forest is lovely, and I have spent many cherished memories there, but it's also rather secluded, and I can only begin to imagine what mysterious things happen under the cover of so many dense twigs and branches and leaves. Anyway, on to the story. Every day to get to school, my mum would drive me and my sister to school in the next town over. The town was also in this forest. However, on this fateful morning we had to stop the car mere seconds after driving off. In the middle of this rather narrow and seldom used road was an elderly woman in her nightgown, splattered with mud and bruises, and seemingly exhausted beyond her wits. She was barefoot, her feet blackened by mud and caked with lashes of blood. She didn't flinch as the car crawled forward towards her, nor did she show any sign of relief as my mum stepped out of the car to greet her. She was terribly confused and didn't seem entirely sure of what to say or how to begin. For a moment, she just babbled incomprehensibly, but within a few seconds, a somewhat coherent sentence began to form. She was repeating that she'd ran all night. Bear in mind it was around 7:30 a.m. in early spring, so the sun had only just risen not long ago. She said she'd run through the forest not knowing where to go, but as she went on, it became clear that she had been trying to escape something. She paused her breath, gathering her thoughts. It was clear this was all a mess in her mind, and just now as she was trying to collect everything coherently. Someone, she continued, had kept her locked up in a cellar. She didn't know where, or how long, or who it was that had locked her up, but she remembered it was very damp and muddy. She didn't remember how she got out of the cellar. All she knew was how she was in the dead of the forest in the dead of night, and so she ran, as much as her frail body would allow. At this point, it seemed like she had nothing more to say, for it seemed like her nighttime escapade had culminated in us meeting her. I don't exactly remember what she and my mum discussed next, but it resulted in my mother calling the old lady's son who lived on the other side of the village. A few minutes later, he arrived and told us we should leave. Fast forward a few days, I asked my mum if she knew what became of the old lady after we left. I'm not sure how my mum found out this bit next, but apparently a few men had broken into her house that night or morning, had beaten her, ransacked her home, stealing some of her priceless possessions. She had apparently fled for cover in the forest, which was only a few meters away from her house. Now, if that wasn't creepy enough, a few extra details stick in mind. First, when we found her in the middle of that narrow road, it turns out she was standing right next to her house. Perhaps the burglars were still in her home as we spoke to her. Her sense of time did seem distorted. Secondly, no mention of the supposed cellar she was kept in or made to stay in. Had that been a fiction of her panic or a delusion? And had she really been locked up in a cellar somewhere in the forest, only for no one to believe her? It seems unlikely, but you do occasionally stumble upon old and grotty stone huts and ruins in the forest. Perhaps some of them hide a few gruesome tales. Unfortunately, we never really spoke to that family again, and we never got to find out about what really happened that night. I believe the elderly lady is now deceased. We will never fully find out the truth about that cellar. But nonetheless, whenever I return home and drive past the house in the narrow street, I can't help but remember the frail lady, standing alone in her muddy nightgown. I've always loved biking. You can say it was my thing. Since getting my first bike at 11, I have loved to ride. And when my family moved to a small city when I was 15 that happened to be ringed with endless mountains, peaks draped in thick forests, and carved with twisting dirt trails that vanished into remote valleys, I was elated. I rode alone for months until meeting a local guy who had grown up threading the very slopes and knew every hidden drop and switchback better than any trail map. Unafraid to veer onto faint, unmarked paths half swallowed by overgrowth, and leading us onto routes that tested our limits. Fellow cyclists will know exactly what I'm talking about, and we hit the trails together nearly every day from then on. Then I followed wherever he pointed, without a second thought of his choices, because we always uncovered the best lines amid the vast wilderness. One thing I should tell you is that I live in a very religious country, where faith shapes everything. Now, some of you might be familiar with the tradition of fasting. That means no food, no water, and bodies running on the energy stored up alone. We were out one day cycling, and adapted by cutting rides to 30-kilometer loops every few days, preserving strength through the dehydration that left our throats raw. And it was deep in the fasting month after one such draining outing, with the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the path as we neared the city edge, where houses began flickering into view through the trees, that he slowed his bike abruptly and nodded towards a narrow gap in the underbrush. He was calling out to me that we should explore this new section. Part of me wanted to, but another very real part of me was exhausted, screaming for home, my mouth parched and muscles burning for rest. But curiosity overrode it all, and we pushed through the tangle and emerged onto a flawless, hidden trail, its packed dirt surface gripping the tires effortlessly as we went deeper and deeper into the forest. That is until our front wheels sank, forcing hard stops amid the unnatural hush. We dismounted, sweat beating cold on our skin as we walked the bikes back along the trail, footsteps crunching loudly in the stillness. It was at that moment when fingers clamped on our shoulders through the fabric with crushing force, rooting me in place as terror flooded my veins. Because 3 men had just silently materialized from behind us from the shadows, wearing ragged clothes encrusted in layers of grime and dirt, and a foul stench followed them. The eldest advanced on us, his voice emerging even as casual, as if encountering us at the roadside rather than deep in the middle of twilit woods, asking simply what we were doing there. My friend replied that we were just riding trails and he'd taken a wrong turn, and was now trying to head back to the city. They edged into a loose arc, hemming our path while questions turned probing, asking about the bike brands, the gear we were using, and more importantly, the money it was worth. One suddenly seized my friend's handlebars to tug the machine closer, and the leader held our gaze steady, and stated without a raised tone that they were sorry, but they were taking the bikes. There was a slight pause, and then asked if we had fasted that day. Our nods coming hoarse through cracked lips, prompting a thin smile, as it was very obvious we had in fact not eaten or drank anything that day. It was at that very moment that the head thief eased, gave us one long last look, and said he was pleased to hear that he and his men were not fasting, that had we not stuck to the religious traditions of our land, he would have sliced us open. My friend, as we were biking away, confessed that he almost pulled out his knife when one of the thieves tried grabbing his bike. Luckily he didn't, because if he'd have done so, we'd probably be dead. I still bike all these years later, but we took a break from exploring new routes for a while after that. You never know what dangers await you when you're out in the middle of nowhere. I'm a 36-year-old male. I was 24 at the time and working as a wilderness guide in WNC, and I was on an 8-day off shift. I didn't have a permanent home at the time, and I'd spend my time off living out in the mountains off the parkway. This particular time I was in camp late at night, just sitting by my fire, and a man roughly my age, maybe a bit older, walked into camp, Said he was hiking the section of the mountain to sea trail that runs by Parkway. Said he pushed further than intended that day, and could he share camp. I allowed it, and we chatted casually before going to sleep. I woke up, and he was gone. I piddled for a few hours and then hiked back up to the parkway where my truck was. I got in and trucked about 30 miles down the parkway and hiked into another site about a mile from the truck. That night he showed up again and played up a big show of it being a coincidence. Now 30 miles in a day on foot through the mountains isn't slouch work, but I'm a fast hiker myself, and he was packed ultralight, so it's not that inconceivable. I gave him permission to share camp again, but I was a bit wary. The next morning he was gone before sunrise again. I decided to test him. I hiked back to my truck and reversed course going back the way I'd come from and parked on the side of the parkway by a trailhead. But then instead I crossed the parkway and hid in a rock encampment and waited. Sure enough, I see an SUV pull up behind my truck. The guy gets out with his backpack, so clearly not actually a through hiker. He had been tracking me by my very distinctive sticker collection on the tailgate of my truck. I watched him hike down the trailhead where he'd assumed I'd went to camp, and once I got a chance I got back in the truck and reversed course again. I drove till I thought he'd give up and then went to set up camp. That night he shows up again, and I don't let on that I know his game now. We share a meal, and I get in my hammock. About 3 a.m. I wake up and this guy is kissing the side of my face and neck while I'm asleep, something you never expect to happen as a man. But fortunately, I am a man, and not a small one either. I crack him in the head with my elbow, jump out my hammock, and at which point went for my long knife on my side. Fortunately for me again, I wrestled in high school and have self-defense training specifically for close quarters. We grappled briefly before I finally got behind him and was able to bar him unconscious. Once he slumped, I bound his hands and feet and dragged his ass to a tree and tied him to it. Then I hiked out to his truck to find it right behind mine. Obviously, that was the case. So I slit all his tires and took my happy ass to Asheville. I grew up and lived in rural New England most of my life, which meant that when I was in high school, if my friends and I wanted to go see a movie, we had to drive for about 45 minutes just to get to the nearest theater. Well, one night my buddy and I decided to go see a movie. I think it was an action flick like Captain America or Judge Dredd or something, so we weren't in a weird headspace from a horror movie or anything like that. And on our way back home, I decided to take the back road so that I could drive a little faster and avoid the main route. Now, back roads in Vermont are a lot of fun, but also scary as hell if you don't know what you're doing. They're basically one-lane dirt roads cutting through endless miles of mountains and forests, with maybe a house every 5 miles or so if you're lucky. So we're on one of these roads. Picture this. The radio is playing and it's snowing. This soft, steady snowfall. We're about halfway home deep in the woods when we come to this hill. At the top of the hill, the road curves. So it's a blind hill in the middle of nowhere, and because of the snow, I slow down a lot more than usual, and we start to come up on it. We round the corner and my headlights hit this spot on the side of the road, where the snow just wasn't falling. And I don't mean it was an empty patch or anything like that. I mean that space itself looked wrong. The snow that should have been falling through that area had just stopped, like it was hanging in the air, suspended almost like a little white speck frozen in place, while the snow kept falling normally all around it. But what made it worse was that it wasn't just empty. There were 3 distinct spots where snow was piling up, like it would if there were people standing there. The way it built up looked exactly like it was landing on shoulders and heads, like there were 3 figures just standing on the side of the road, completely still and invisible, except for the snow collecting on them. It stayed like that long enough for me to actually process what I was looking at, not just a quick glance or something my brain filled in, but a few solid seconds where I could clearly see it. Then all at once the build-up just collapsed, the snow dropped, the shape disappeared, and it looked like every other part of the roadside, again, as I drove past. I didn't say anything at first, I just kept driving. For a while it was completely silent in the car while I tried to make sense of what I had just seen in my head, and come up with some kind of logical explanation, like maybe it was the wind or the way the headlights hit the snow or something like that. But nothing really made sense the more I thought about it. So eventually I asked him, "Did you see that?" He looked at me for a moment and I could tell right away by his face that something was off, and he said to me, "Oh, thank God, I thought I was hallucinating." That pretty much made my stomach drop. We both started describing what we saw, trying not to influence each other, and it was the exact same thing. The same three shapes. The same way the snow was piling up. The same weird empty space where the snowfall just stopped and hung in the air underneath them, while everything else kept falling like normal. At that point, we turned the car around and went back. We drove up and down that same stretch of road a few times, really slowly this time, scanning the sides, watching the way the snow was falling, trying to find anything that could explain it. There were no branches hanging over the road, no weird wind patterns, nothing that would block the snow like that, and definitely nothing that would make it look like it was piling up on something that wasn't there. But there was nothing. The spot looked completely ordinary, like nothing had ever happened there before. We didn't see it again, and didn't stick around much longer after that. In mid-August of 2025, my boyfriend, my best friend and I took a week-long trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and stayed near Cosby. We'd already done a massive mountain hike, Mount Kamer, earlier in the week, Davenport Gap, and many other intermediate trails too. So, by our last day, we were intentionally slowing things down. I picked a shorter trail near Cosby, about 5 miles round trip, that led to the remains of an old steam engine. It seemed quiet and low-key, like a good way to end the trip. When we got there, the parking area was completely empty. There were no cars and no hikers. Nothing. It's worth mentioning here, I'm the spiritually inclined one. I'm open to weird liminal, maybe there's more going on here kind of stuff. But they were also not so inclined to go on this final hike, so no matter what happened on the trail, I was going to be optimistic. Now my boyfriend and my best friend are the opposite of feeling any other sense, very grounded, very rational, there's a logical explanation for everything. They don't entertain spooky-ooky ideas at all, so if I'm feeling weird, they are always there to reassure me with their logic. So, just right as we get to the trailhead, we noticed an old, rusty hatchet embedded into a tree. Genuinely wished I had taken a picture, but once again at the time I brushed it off, because they didn't want to be on this hike, and I wanted to make the most of our last moments in the Smokies. So I tried to be as normal about it as possible without putting up any warning signs. But in hindsight, it felt like a warning sign we ignored. About halfway in, there was a detour to a small cemetery, which isn't unusual in the Smokies, and we took it. Only a handful of graves being raised deep in the Ozarks. This wasn't an unfamiliar sight to me. I assumed it was probably a family cemetery. The headstones were old and weathered, some barely readable, and the whole place felt very tucked away. We were careful where we stepped, and kept our voices low without really thinking about it. It didn't really feel like a place to rush through or joke around in. Oddly though, it didn't really feel creepy at all. There was no sense of being watched or unwelcome. If anything, it felt calm and steady, almost like the most peaceful part of our hike. I remember thinking that if there were anywhere else on the trail you'd expect to feel uneasy, it would be there. But instead it felt settled. Looking back, that contrast is part of what made the rest of the trail feel so unsettling, because whatever felt wrong later on I really don't think it came from there. So we turned back around to the actual trail and continued on to the steam engine remains, looking around briefly, and then turned back. And this is where things took a turn. The sky darkened quickly, the way it sometimes does in the mountains. I checked the weather app and it showed clear skies everywhere else, which isn't impossible given how localized mountain weather can be. Still, it was noticeable. Then, every so often, there was this low, soft noise that my brain registered as a growl. Realistically, it could have been wind, insects, or a distant animal. We stopped multiple times to listen, but whenever we did, the sound stopped too. What made it unsettling wasn't the sound itself, but how my body reacted to it. I hike a lot, and while this was my first time in the Smokies, we've already been on a surplus of hikes at every hour of the day and night. I heard animals, rustling, sudden noises. This felt different, not louder or scarier, but sort of wrong. I had this deep physical awareness of being exposed, like I needed to keep moving. Not panic, just alertness. And later that night at dinner, we spoke about the hike. My boyfriend mentioned that he had been hearing chittering sounds on the walk back. Not animal chittering, but human, like someone whispering almost. And my best friend immediately said she heard it too. Again, there are explanations for that. Sounds carry strangely in forests, especially on empty trails, but we hadn't passed a single person, and the trail was a straight there and back with no side trails. There wasn't an obvious source for voices that close. Both of them admitted that they felt uneasy on that trail, not scared of something specific, just uncomfortable, like they wanted to be off it. Coming from two people who don't believe in anything spooky, that stood out to me. And truly, that's what the trail was like. Not spooky, not scary, but it was the first time we felt like, crap, we don't belong here. Something doesn't want us here. There is one last detail that sticks with me. On the way in, there was a large spider web stretched between two trees, fully blocking the trail. My boyfriend is tall and had been running into cobwebs all week, but this one had one large spider sitting in the center, so he noticed it and warned us to duck. We did. On the way back, the web was gone. Spiders do move their webs, wind happens and animals pass through, I know all of that. It just felt strange because the trail had been empty, and the web hadn't been damaged but simply disappeared. Nothing overtly happened on the trail, no clear threat, no moment where we ran or turned back. But out of all the miles we walked that week, the trail is the only one where all three of us independently felt the same thing, that we did not belong there. And even knowing there were logical explanations, that feeling still hasn't gone away. Me and my brother attempted camping in the Mark Twain National Forest, totally primitive style and not a campground, just in the woods alone in a tent. And also decided to take a heroic dose of shrooms for some reason. At first it was really wonderful. There were butterflies everywhere. We decided to sit in the river for a while, and suddenly we started to feel a bit off. It felt like we were being watched, and we kept catching a whiff of tremendous rot stench on the wind that would come and go. We felt an urgency to go back to camp and start a fire, so we did. Then we noticed there were a lot of butterflies, like a disturbing amount, and it felt incredibly eerie. My brother was gathering logs nearby and discovered a dead duck and then another, and then a few chickens. We realized it was an entire trail of dead ducks and chickens leading back into the woods, a darkened part within a thicket. We decided to lay down in the tent and try to overcome the eerie feeling, thinking maybe it was all a coincidence and because we're under the influence. But at the same time, we both felt a frantic need to get out before dark. It was like your first time playing Minecraft when the sun went down, knowing monsters will spawn. We just felt very strongly that we could not stay there at night. We packed everything so frantically that we accidentally broke our tent and then hurried home. Literally the second we got out of that part of the forest, we felt a relief wash over us that we couldn't even explain. It was like the eyes of a predator were no longer upon us. We went back the next day for our beach towels, and we also wanted to see how different the vibe was while sober, and if all those dead ducks and chickens were still there. They were, and the vibe was the same. At the river, the exact same spot we were sitting, someone made rock stacks, one for me and one for my brother, and also added a line of rocks dividing the river from where we sat. It was absolutely bizarre, especially because we went back in the morning, so if someone did it and not some creature of the woods, they had a lot of time on their hands apparently. And why would you even do that? And were they watching us? How did they know exactly where we sat in the river, and why didn't they touch our beach towels? Dumbest thing we've ever done, but it was certainly quite ominous at the time. Hey guys, it's Mortit, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed tonight's collection of Deep Woods stories, and if of course you did, you can let me know down below. Your thoughts and comments are always very much appreciated. I would also like to extend an extra thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. Rewards for signing up include birthday shoutouts, picking the topic of your choice, and much, much more. You can find out in the links below. But that's it from me. Stay awesome, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.